Now, this had killed the market for, of course. Well, sorry guys, we have our electricity on and off because we're having a very heavy downpour here in Uganda. Of course, today's topic is about the Emperor Haile Selassie, who is like not as the Rastafarian Messiah. Um, Here, Emperor Haile Selassie, of course, was an emperor of Ethiopia around year 1930 to 47. He was also known for modernizing his country and helping to establish the Organization of African Unity, which now we call the African Union, and of course a lot of humanitarian work. Um, Selassie was assassinated, of course, because truthfully,
So, guys, we apologize for today. We apologize. Our electricity has not been so good. our electricity stability. Our electricity stability has not been so good today. We apologize for that, for the ups and downs we've had to. We are really very sorry, very sorry. That's not how we do things. Uh, it is just for today. Let's pray to tomorrow. It doesn't fray. You know, electricity is on and off. I may be talking. Whew, it goes off. We apologize for that. For that. But of course, today we are talking about Emperor Haile Selassie and being a Rastafarian Messiah. Many Rastafarians actually call this guy, actually, they praise him as a god. So, this, of course, when you look at, actually, when you look at to Rastafarians. Actually, we made the introduction. Who is Selassie? Who Emperor Haile Selassie is? His life stuff. Though we have been in bits, like maybe talking and electricity goes off. But how? Of course, today we see that Haile Selassie is worshipped as God incarnate among some followers of the Rastafarian movement, taken from actually the Selassie's pre-imperial name Ras, meaning head, a title looking equivalent to a duke. So Tafari Makonnen, which emerged in Jamaica during the 1930s under the influence of Leonard Howell, a follower of Marcus Garvey's African redemption movement. He's viewed as the Messiah who will
The man known to history as Emperor Haile Selassie I was born on the 23rd of July 1892 in the town of Ejarsogoro, not far from the city of Harar in Ethiopia. He was given the name Tafari Makonnen in his youth. Lige simply means child of, while Tafari means one who is respected or feared. Makonnen was his father's name, and so, as he was growing up, he was known as the child of Makonnen, who is greatly respected. His father, Ras Makonnen, was the governor of the ancient walled city of Harar in eastern Ethiopia, and a key advisor to his near kinsman, Emperor Menelik II, who was emperor at the time. Thus, Tafari Makonnen was born into a significant noble family which was related to the current imperial dynasty. Through his paternal grandmother, Tafari was descended from the Sonic line of kings who had ruled this part of Africa since the 13th century. Tafari's mother was Woizero Yeshimebet Ali, the daughter of a ruling chief from Wollo province to the north. Any exploration of Tafari's life must start by exploring the nature of Ethiopian society and the empire that ruled it in the late 19th century. Ethiopia and the wider Horn of Africa have a unique history. 1700 years ago, when the Roman Empire ruled all of North Africa, Roman Egypt emerged as a major early center of Christianity in the eastern Mediterranean. Soon, the new religion spread south beyond the borders of the Roman Empire, down the River Nile and the coast of the Red Sea. It gained many adherents in what is now Ethiopia, which effectively became a Christian country. However, with the Arab conquests of the Middle East and North Africa in the 7th century AD, Ethiopia was effectively cut off from the rest of the Christian world, but it did not convert to Islam. Accordingly, over the centuries, a unique form of Christianity developed here, one which continued to adhere to many of the rites which were typical of the 4th century church. Moreover, Ethiopian politics and culture became shrouded in biblical legend, and from the 13th century onwards, the rulers of the Kingdom of Ethiopia claimed to be descended from the biblical King Solomon. Therefore, their dynastic line has become known as the Solomonic dynasty. This Solomonic dynasty ruled a kingdom which centuries ago only constituted part of northern Ethiopia, but between the 13th and 19th centuries, it began expanding to the south, west, and east, eventually covering an area approximate to modern-day Ethiopia. As it did so, the Ethiopian Empire became a multicultural state, one which had many different ethnic peoples living under the rule of the emperors. The foremost of these were the Oromo and Amhara people, who between them made up over half the population of the empire. But significant minorities included the Somalis in the far south and east of the country and the Tigrayans in the northeast. These different ethnicities spoke different languages and had somewhat different appearances. For instance, the Oromo are a Cushitic people who dominated the northwestern part of the country and had been more responsive to the spread of Islam into the region. The Amhara are a Semitic people who dominated the highlands of Ethiopia and were much more committed to Oriental Orthodox Christianity. These ethnic and religious divisions would influence Selassie's rule and indeed the entire history of modern Ethiopia. Indeed, so central are they to the country's history that the alternative name which was used for the Ethiopian Empire at the time of Tafari's birth was Abyssinia, from the Arabic Habasa term for mixture, a reference to the multicultural nature of the empire. By the mid-19th century, the Ethiopian Empire had become one of the most powerful states in Africa, and it needed to be, for the great European powers were entering into a period of accelerated colonization of the continent. To the north, Egypt had effectively become a British protectorate, and British rule was being extended down the River Nile into Sudan, Ethiopia's western neighbor, and eventually into Uganda and Kenya, the southern neighbors of Abyssinia. To the east of Abyssinia, along the coastline of the Horn of Africa, a number of European powers acquired territory through treaties and military intervention in the years leading up to Tafari's birth. The foremost of these was the Kingdom of Italy, which acquired the colonies of Italian Somaliland and Eritrea in the 1880s, comprising most of the modern-day countries of Eritrea and Somalia. The British and French also carved out small enclaves in northern Somaliland. In the end, nearly all of Africa was annexed by the European powers in what has become known as the Scramble for Africa. However, Abyssinia avoided this fate, in large part because Emperor Menelik II, who came to power in 1889, began a program of modernization. He established Addis Ababa as a strong new capital in the center of the empire and developed an alliance with the Russian Empire from 1893 onwards. Through this, the Russians sent military advisors, scientists, and economists to Abyssinia to advise the country on how to modernize its government, economy, and military, with a view to withstanding encroachments by the Italians, British, French, and others. Thus, when Tafari was born in 1892, a new era of Ethiopian history was beginning. As a son of a major Ethiopian noble, Tafari was afforded honors from a young age. For instance, when he was just 13 years old, he was given the title of Dejazmach of Gara Mulata, an administrative region near the city of Harar. Dejazmach literally means keeper of the door, and shows that he was a protector of sorts of the region, while still barely a teenager. Yet there was little sign at this time that he would ascend to a position of imperial authority, for despite the fact that he was related to the imperial family, Emperor Menelik II had a clear line of succession in place. He had two daughters, Sharega and Zewditu. Through these, Menelik had several grandsons, one of whom, Lij Iyasu, the son of Sharega, was eventually designated by Menelik as his successor. Meanwhile, Tafari's youth also saw a concerted effort by the Kingdom of Italy to connect its two colonies of Eritrea and Somaliland by conquering Abyssinia. In 1895, the Italians invaded Abyssinia, but Emperor Menelik's modernization efforts proved beneficial, and the short-lived First Italo-Ethiopian War ended a year later in 1896, when an Italian invasion force of some 15,000 men were decisively defeated by a much larger Ethiopian army of upwards of 75,000 at the Battle of Adwa. With this, Abyssinia's independence was secured for a generation. In his teenage years, Tafari was promoted further within the empire. In 1907, for instance, he was appointed as a governor of the province of Sidamo in the south of Ethiopia. He sired a daughter during this time, the future Princess Romanwalk, though the identity of her mother is not entirely certain. In 1911, he married Menen Asfau, also a member of the imperial family. This was around the time when Emperor Menelik II, who was nearing his 70th year, became increasingly more incapacitated due to a series of strokes he had suffered. He eventually died in 1913, leaving his 18-year-old grandson Liju Iyasu as the emperor designate. Iyasu had been serving as de facto emperor for some. Under such circumstances, this might have allowed him to solidify his position in advance of the emperor's death, but instead the direct opposite had occurred. Iyasu had found himself increasingly opposed by the Council of Ministers which his grandfather had established, and even by his own aunt, Menelik's younger daughter, Princess Zewditu. Thus, when Menelik finally died in December 1913, the Council of Ministers and the princess suppressed news of his passing and did not confirm Iyasu as the new emperor. He was left to enjoy some semblance of power in the months that followed, but his accession would never be proclaimed, and he would never be given an imperial name. There were multiple reasons for this opposition to Iyasu. Firstly, in the final years of Menelik's reign, the young prince had shown himself disinclined to the kind of administration and management which was necessary for the ruler of a rapidly modernizing empire. Secondly, and more importantly, there were concerns that he was disposed to Islam over the Christian faith, which was central to Ethiopian political life. The latter issue was unacceptable to the Council of Ministers, and when rumors that Iyasu had converted to Islam mounted in the mid-1910s, they moved to depose him as emperor in the autumn of 1916. He was placed under arrest and would spend the rest of his life, down to the mid-1930s, in detention. Following his removal from power, Zewditu was proclaimed as Empress of Ethiopia. But with the succession now unsure, it was decided that her cousin, Lineage Tafari Makonnen, the future Emperor Haile Selassie, would be appointed as her regent and designated successor. Evidently, Tafari's tenure as a regional governor of several provinces in the late 1900s and into the 1910s had been successful, and he had weathered the political intrigue of the years of Iyyasu's brief reign very well. Thus, the stage was set for Tafari to one day succeed Selassie-II, who was entering her 40s when she became empress and did not have any other clear successor. In the years that followed, a clear delineation developed within the government of Abyssinia between Empress Selassie-II and the regent Tafari. She was a traditionalist and a conservative ruler, while he was following the path hewn by Emperor Menelik II
Exactly.
in wishing to modernize.
Abyssinia, not ancient
The
Ethiopia.
empress was by far the
Them
more
people up
powerful
there are
figure,
not the
but her
Ethiopians of the
position was
Bible.
weaker than any of her predecessors as ruler of Abyssinia.
When people try to change the name to Ethiopia, these mixed ass niggas try to believe that those are not Ethiopians. Those people you see up there today are not Ethiopians. Not in no goofy Bible and not historically. Those are mixed Arab people in that area now. Those are not Ethiopians would be a Setu, a Maria. You would be the ancient Ethiopians, not them people you see today. They changed that so they lay claim to ancient Ethiopian history, which are not them. Shout out to people on TikTok understanding that and making that clear. These motherfuckers ain't no ancient Ethiopians. They damn sure ain't. So spare me with all that ancient Sheba and Solomon bullshit. Spare me with that shit. That's some moronic ass Ethiopian tell me that shit. You know, I'm descended from Solomon and Queen of Sheba. I said, no, you're not. No, you're not. The hell you are. The fuck you are. The fuck you are. You ain't descended from none of that. I got all shocked, looking all crazy. I said, you can go all crazy and look all shocked. You ain't. You're not. Okay? White man trying to make a false history for you people. You're not. Ancient Ethiopia. Ancient Ethiopia was Sudan. Not you. Not Abyssinia. It's what they call Sudan and South Sudan today. That was ancient Ethiopia. Then all of Africa at one time was Ethiopia. Okay, then it became just the Sudanese region, the Kush region. Not you people. Okay? You get that clear. You try to steal you like white people. You try to steal other people's history and then say these people in these Bibles. No, you're not. But how you guys doing? Who's this? Maria and Seth, you guys back on? I thought you guys came on earlier today. Can you guys hear me? You guys there? Uh-oh. You guys froze again? You guys there? I guess you there, Seto? Guess not. The guy froze, the Seto froze. Let me get out of here. Let me get my ass out of here.
For the simple reason that she was a woman in a society which prioritized male rule. As such, Tafari was able to claim a great deal more influence than would have been typical of the power dynamic between them in most other circumstances. Both had their factions. She was favored by the Ethiopian church, which looked kindly on her conservative values, while Tafari was supported by a clear majority of the Council of Ministers. Eventually, in the course of the 1920s, he emerged as the more powerful figure, and long before her rule would end, Zewditu had begun to withdraw from government and allowed Tafari to continue his modernization efforts in the 1920s. The modernization program, which was implemented in the 1920s, was multifaceted. Much of it centered and administration of Abyssinia to make it more like those of the European powers. There was a precedent for this. The non-European power which had modernized most effectively in the 19th century was the Empire of Japan. It had done so by adopting Western methods and had thus resisted Western encroachments and established itself as a major power itself in the Far East by the 1920s. Abyssinia aimed to at least partially emulate this approach. Thus, a Western-style government was established by Tafari, one with ministers responsible for individual aspects of governance. In tandem, there was a move away from the feudal nature of Ethiopian government to a political system where individuals were promoted based on their abilities rather than their noble rank. Finally, Abyssinia applied for membership in the newly established League of Nations, a forerunner of the United Nations. It became a member in 1923, one of the few non-Western nations to ever become a member of the League. Even more significant were the attempted economic and social reforms which were introduced during the reign of Empress Zewditu and the regency of Tafari. Already the first electricity grids had been introduced to Addis Ababa in the mid-1910s, and this was expanded outwards in the 1920s. At the same time, efforts were initiated to begin linking the main cities with roads and eventually railway lines. The telegraph and other communication systems, which had become commonplace in the Western world in the second half of the 19th century, also finally arrived to Abyssinia, albeit in a limited fashion. The National Bank of Ethiopia was founded in 1927 to bolster the economy, and excessive lending rates were prohibited. Perhaps most importantly, the judicial system was overhauled with the Feta Negas law code, a legal system which had been used in Ethiopia for centuries and which imposed brutal punishments for moderate crimes, such as the loss of a hand for being found guilty of theft, was gradually phased out in favor of a Western judicial system based on elements of the civil and common law. But there was a major backward element to Abyssinian society which remained. Slavery was still widespread here, a century after it had been prohibited throughout much of the Western world. Tokenistic efforts were made to end this in the 1920s as the Western powers criticized the retention of the system in Ethiopia. But Tafari was unwilling to commit to any major efforts to eliminate it from Abyssinian society at this time. Meanwhile, Tafari's international reputation was growing, and by the end of the 1920s, he was increasingly viewed as the face of Abyssinia on the world stage, rather than the empress. Much of this was owing to numerous trips abroad and state visits. For instance, in 1924, he undertook a tour of numerous foreign capitals and major cities with other members of the extended imperial family and the government. This was a fact-finding mission as much as anything else, as Tafari and others sought to gain from direct experience of the Western societies they were attempting to emulate. The Abyssinian delegation, with its ostentatious displays of wealth and court ritual, made a significant impression in London and Paris, where Tafari met King George V and the French Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré. Another significant goal of this foreign tour was to try to convince the British and French governments to provide Abyssinia with access to the Red Sea by surrendering some territory in its colonial enclaves in Somaliland. Elsewhere, in the Middle East and North Africa, Tafari was greeted warmly as the all-but head of state of virtually the only African nation which had withstood European colonization in the 19th century. All of this ensured that, before he would ever become emperor, Tafari was well established on the international stage. By 1928, Tafari's position at home in Abyssinia was such that the empress could not but promote him ever further. By this time, he had monopolized power within the Council of Ministers and, more importantly, had also moved to secure the loyalty of the heads of the military and police forces. Thus, on the 7th of October 1928, he was crowned as Negus, an Abyssinian title equivalent to a king, though still below that of emperor or empress. This replaced his earlier honorific of Ras, which had signified his position within the imperial line. In the months that followed, tensions began to brew between the Empress's faction and that of Tafari, ultimately culminating in January 1930 in the outbreak of a borderline civil war between Tafari and Gugsewella, the Empress's husband. He not only wished to reassert his wife's authority within the empire, but now had designs of replacing Tafari as the head of the government and having himself crowned as emperor. Gugsewella's rebellion culminated in a major meeting of his forces and the supporters of Tafari at the Battle of Anj on the 31st of March 1930, but with their superior Western armaments and methods, which included the use of modern aircraft, Tafari's supporters quickly defeated Gugsewella's army. He himself was killed in the fighting. Then, in a seemingly unconnected development, the Empress died of natural causes just 2 days later, clearing the way for Tafari to claim absolute power in Abyssinia after years of dual rule between him and the Empress. A mourning period of over half a year was imposed following the passing of Empress Zewditu. But at last, on the 2nd of November 1930, Tafari was proclaimed as the new Emperor of Abyssinia and crowned that same day at the Cathedral of St. George in Addis Ababa. Emissaries from many Western nations attended the event, and Tafari featured on the cover of Time magazine that November. He also adopted a new name and title. The title he obtained was now Negusa Nagast, the King of Kings, while his imperial name would be Haile Selassie. Haile means power of, and Selassie means Trinity, so the name Haile Selassie effectively means the power of the Trinity. However, as we will see later, the former name he bore for much of the 1920s, Rastafari, was to gain currency again in later years and become increasingly well-known globally. More immediately, in the early 1930s, just after his accession as Emperor Haile Selassie I, the new ruler of Ethiopia quickly oversaw the introduction of Ethiopia's first modern constitution in 1931. This provided for the establishment of a bicameral legislature, with a parliament and an upper house of lords, with whom the emperor would share power. It was also intended that a new constitution would further lead to the end of the Feta Nagast legal system and its replacement with a Western judicial code. The first years of Selassie's reign as emperor were marked by his efforts to continue and expand the modernization program he had first initiated as regent in the 1920s. However, a shadow was increasingly hanging over Ethiopia. Back in 1922, the Italian government had been taken over by the National Fascist Party led by Benito Mussolini after the infamous march on Rome by 30,000 paramilitary fascist blackshirts. One of Mussolini's great desires was to build Italy into a great power again and to resurrect the empire Italians had enjoyed back in the days of Rome 2 millennia earlier. To that end, in the 1920s, he had engaged in a series of aggressive actions, initiating a brutal war of conquest in Libya, which had been a nominal colony of Italy's since 1912, as well as bombing the island of Corfu during a dispute with the Kingdom of Greece, annexing the city of Fiume in what is now Croatia and establishing a protectorate over Albania through a series of treaties in the mid-1920s. With these advances made, in the early 1930s, Mussolini's attentions turned to the Horn of Africa, where he increasingly wished to correct what he deemed to be an historical failing of Italy's, its loss to Ethiopia in the First Italo-Ethiopian War back in the 1890s. If Abyssinia could be conquered, it would also make a continuous colony of Italy's lands in Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Italian Somaliland, in turn making it the predominant colonial power in the Horn of Africa. In 1934, tensions between Selassie's government and the Italian colonial administration in Eritrea and Somaliland began to flare over a long-running boundary dispute which had been caused by Italy's wish to build a railway line through the region connecting its two divided colonies, which Ethiopia was in the middle of. This had culminated in Italy building a military fort at Walwal in eastern Ethiopia. In December 1934, the Italian presence here was challenged by Selassie's government when Abyssinian troops were sent to Walwal. On the 5th of December, this led to violent engagements between the Italians and the Ethiopians, resulting in dozens of deaths on both sides. An international diplomatic standoff followed, now known as the Abyssinia Crisis. In early January 1935, Selassie's government protested to the League of Nations. Months of diplomatic toing and froing would follow, but essentially the British and French governments, who were best placed to act as intermediaries, were unwilling to block Italian aggression at a time when they were trying to win over Mussolini as an ally in Europe, in the face of the rise of the Nazis following Adolf Hitler's seizure of power in Germany in 1933. Consequently, while negotiations followed for months, it eventually became clear to Selassie's government that the Italians were intent on using the Walwal incident in December 1934 and the ensuing diplomatic standoff as an excuse to declare war on Abyssinia, and that the League of Nations was not going to take any effective measures to try to stop Mussolini's aggression. The Second Italo-Abyssinian October 1935, when the Italian general Emilio de Bono crossed over the border from Italy's colony of Eritrea into northern Ethiopia with tens of thousands of Italian troops. There was no formal declaration of war. This was to be one of the most significant conflicts globally during the interwar period between the First World War and the Second World War, eventually involving hundreds of thousands of troops and personnel on both sides. It would last for just over a half a year. The sides were evenly matched throughout, though. While the Ethiopians were numerically superior, despite the best efforts to modernize their army since the 1890s, their forces were still resoundingly based on mass infantry divisions. For instance, Selassie's government had just a handful of tanks, and the Ethiopian Air Force consisted of little more than a dozen planes. By way of contrast, Mussolini's government was eventually able to deploy hundreds of tanks in East Africa, as well as massive artillery barrages and a significant air force presence. Thus, while the Italian army would be shown in later years to be enormously deficient in European terms, the war, which was initiated in the autumn of 1935, was clearly a David versus Goliath type conflict, in which the Italians had the upper hand in a way which they had not back in 1895 when the First Italo-Ethiopian War was launched. In response to the invasion of Abyssinia, the League of Nations sanctioned Italy on the 7th of October 1935, 4 days after the initial incursion by de Bono's troops. The two primary countries within the League to whom the responsibility fell for challenging the Italian government's actions were Britain and France, who were the foremost colonial powers across the African continent and who had colonies nearby themselves in Somaliland and all across Ethiopia's western and southern borders in Sudan and national government of Stanley Baldwin in Britain campaigned on and won an election in November 1935 on the premise of supporting the League of Nations and its mission. Baldwin's government almost immediately capitulated to Italian aggression. Within days of arriving in office, the French counterpart, Pierre Laval, who was also the French Prime Minister at the time, about how the war could be quickly brought to an end. Here, the desire to appease Italy and prevent it from drifting closer to Nazi Germany was paramount, and the Hoare-Laval Pact, details of which were leaked by the British press in early December, effectively outlined a plan whereby Abyssinia would lose roughly half of its territory to Italy, allowing the Italians to connect their colonies of Eritrea and Somaliland. This was completely unacceptable to Selassie's government and a complete betrayal of the mandate of the League of Nations. Outrage followed. Hoare resigned
Sorry, guys. Our internet is up and down, and we are freezing consecutively. We have a heavy, heavy downpour here in Uganda, and I guess this is why we are on and off. We have been trying to, of course, struggling to come since 3 until now. But of course, let me continue a little bit. Emperor Haile Selassie, we know that fast is exactly the one we have been talking about. He is remembered for his significant contributions to Ethiopia and the broader Africa continent. Haile Selassie initiated extensive reforms to modernize Ethiopia. He also introduced a constitution in 1931 which aimed to establish a parliamentary system and curb the power of regional nobility. He also modernized the military, education, healthcare, and infrastructure of the country. He sought to bring Ethiopia into the modern world while preserving its independence. During the 1935 Italian invasion of Ethiopia, of course, that is the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, Haile Selassie became a symbol of anti-colonial resistance. Although his forces were temporarily defeated, he appealed to the League of Nations in 1936, denouncing the Italian aggression. Now, his famous speech to the League was a powerful statement against fascism and imperialism. Now, after World War II, with the support of the Allies, he was restored to power in
As
Ethiopia.
British Foreign Minister, and ultimately the revelation of details of the pact brought to an end any efforts to find a diplomatic solution to the conflict. The Hall-Laval Pact and the wider Abyssinia crisis is generally seen as also sounding the death knell of the League of Nations, an institution which had now conclusively proven its inability to prevent aggressive nations like Italy and the Empire of Japan from invading its enemies with no justification. With the termination of diplomatic negotiations in December 1935, the war intensified on the ground in Abyssinia. By now, the Ethiopian government was making preparations for its own counter-offensive against the Italian incursion in the north. This was led by Selassie in person and had hoped to sever the Italian lines of communication and launch a counter-invasion of Eritrea. Initially, it met with considerable success, but in the early months of 1936, the tide turned once General Pietro Badoglio, who had previously overseen the Italian campaign in Libya, was appointed as governor of Eritrea and the leader of the military effort in succession to De Bono, whose oversight of the invasion had been deemed too cautious by Mussolini. Badoglio initiated a brutal campaign in January 1936, in which poison gas was widely used against the Ethiopian armies. Through these methods, a series of victories were quickly won by Badoglio at the battles of Tembien, Amba Aradam, and Shire in northern Ethiopia in the late winter and early spring of 1936. A final effort to maintain the northern front by Selassie was defeated at the Battle of Mechu on the 31st of March 1936, following which northern Ethiopia was effectively under Italian control. On the 26th of April 1936, Badoglio launched what he termed the March of the Iron Will, a swift drive southwards from the northern front around Dessie in Wollo province towards the Abyssinian the 26th of April 1936, Badoglio launched what he termed the March of the Iron Will, a swift drive southwards from the northern front around Dessie in Wollo province towards the Abyssinian capital of Addis Ababa, a distance of some 200 kilometers. The campaign was accompanied by much fanfare and propaganda in the fascist media back home in Italy. A large mechanized column was the centerpiece of this drive, with over 2,000 tanks, cars, trucks, and other vehicles included in the operation, which transported some 12,500 Italian troops speedily towards Selassie's capital. By now, the Ethiopian armies were decimated from the northern offensive, and as the Italians neared Addis Ababa in early May, the emperor and his family fled from the capital and made their way towards the border with French Somaliland, crossing over as Selassie went into what would be years of exile from his realm. 3 days later, at roughly 4 p.m. on the afternoon of the 5th of May 1936, Badoglio arrived in Addis Ababa at the front of a column of 1,700 vehicles. In the hours that followed, Italian troops began entering the city in what was more of a procession than an actual siege and occupied prominent buildings all over the capital. The war was now effectively over. The Second Italo-Ethiopian War came to an end in May 1936 with the fall of Addis Ababa and the flight of Emperor Haile Selassie from Ethiopia. However, pockets of resistance remained, particularly in the south and west of the country, which fighting would continue for months and years to come of Italian control. Yet, from May 1936, the Italian government claimed to have won the war. As such, the new colony of Italian Ethiopia was declared to be in existence by Mussolini on the 9th of May 1936. However, this was soon annexed into the newly proclaimed colony of Italian East Africa, which incorporated Abyssinia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland, and which stretched all the way across the Horn of Africa, completing the ambition for Italy to create a contiguous colony here 40 years after it had first been attempted in the mid-1890s.
Anyway, today the day has been so disappointing. Our network is not stable. The electricity. But of course, for those who are just joining, thank you for joining us here on Black Author Network. We are talking about Emperor Haile Selassie, the Rastafarian Messiah, like the Rastafarian call him. Um, he's a man that a lot of people call a hero because of different things. Among them, defending Ethiopian independence, which of course happened during the 1935 Italian invasion of Ethiopia, which is known as the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. Now, Haile Selassie became a symbol of anti-colonial resistance. Although his forces were temporarily defeated, he appealed to the League of Nations in 1936, denouncing the Italian aggression. Now, his famous speech to the League was a powerful statement against fascism and imperialism. After World War II, with the support of the Allies, he was restored to power in Ethiopia. Haile Selassie was a key advocate for African unity and independence. He played a leading role in the formation of the Organization of the African Union. We usually talk about the African Union, of course, which was formed in 1963, which later became the, by that time it was the Organization of the African Unity. In 1963, which later, of course, became the African Union of now. He encouraged newly independent African nations to collaborate in their efforts to combat colonialism, imperialism, and apartheid. If at all you follow a lot of people who call themselves the Rastafari, Rastafarians always believe that they are the peacemakers, they are humble people, they're humanitarians. There are people who support nature. Let me say, most of the things most Rastafarians follow now. These were the, of course, these were the things that Emperor Haile Selassie, of course, preached about. There was a time that reached when he was tying a turban on his head, and we also see a lot of Rastafarians tying turbans on their head. Emperor Haile Selassie was a typical example of spiritual people, because it was believed that at a certain given time he would even go and pray to nature and his ancestors. He was never afraid of the world seeing him do that. And actually he laid a lot. He left a legacy. He laid, of course, bows to a lot of people that they are still playing on. Emperor Haile Selassie, actually, a lot of people don't know about him. And we also hear a lot of people talking about one of the countries in Africa that wasn't colonized, but of course, and of course, Ethiopia is among them. But we know that at a certain time, at least they had the Italians invading and all that, of course, chaos that was in Ethiopia, and them, of course, being rescued by Emperor Haile Selassie and others who are in support now. He also, like I said, focused on leading, of course, Africa to the top. He was among the leaders who wanted Africa to unite, and he was among the people who proposed the formation of the Organization of the African Unity, which we call now the African Union. Emperor Haile Selassie was about unifying the Africans on the African continent. His legacy spread all over, not only Africa, but also to some parts of America, more especially in the Caribbean and Jamaica, to mention. Of course, Jamaica's in the Caribbean, but you would find a lot of people who supported Haile Selassie in Jamaica, and we have a lot of Rastafarians who still live his legacy, and they, of course, do exactly what he was preaching about. Haile Selassie's love for black people did not only electricity has gone. You know, so just telling me electricity is gone. Ah, shit. Today, our day hasn't been great because shit. Of course, we know that we have we have had a toil and different painful experiences in Africa, among them colonialism, imperialism, apartheid, you know, and all these things. If you look at Emperor Haile Selassie's speeches, most of his speeches were strong ones. But before we get to some of the words that usually used, let's still continue with the great things that he did. He abolished slavery. One of his most important domestic achievements was the abolishment of slavery in Ethiopia. All right. Although slavery had been illegal, it persisted in practice. Haile Selassie made efforts to eradicate the institution and sought to align Ethiopia's policies with the modern humanitarian standard. He was a humanitarian, and I say, I guess this is why a lot of people call themselves Rastafaris, you know, feel like he's their mentor. All right. Selassie placed significant emphasis on education as a tool of national progress. He established many schools and universities, including Haile Selassie I University, which is now known as the Addis Ababa University. Of course, you know Addis Ababa is the capital of Ethiopia. I even don't know why they had to change Haile Selassie University to Addis Ababa. I guess this was done by current presidents. Instead of them leaving their own legacy, they had to wipe away Haile Selassie's legacy, and they named it. Crazy people, yo, but whatever. We are used to them. He promoted higher education for both men and women. His government also worked to build roads, telecommunication, and other critical infrastructure to improve the nation's economic and connectivity. Haile Selassie is revered by the Rastafarian movement as a messianic figure. Like I said, Rastafarians see him as the returned Messiah who will lead African people and people of African descent globally to freedom and dignity. All right. His coronation in 1930 and his status as the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah elevates his image beyond Ethiopia. If you still follow, most of the Rastafarian flags have that lion, and it's known as the Lion of Judah, right? The Lion of Judah, it represents Emperor Haile Selassie, as Rastafaris call him. And they call him a true Rastafari and a man who promoted Rastafari as, I don't want to say the word cult. Haile Selassie was a strong supporter of internationalism and collective security. Ethiopia was one of the founding members of the United Nations, and Haile Selassie constantly advocated for global cooperation and peace. His speech at the United Nations in 1963, which was calling for human rights, world peace, and opposition to radical discrimination, remains iconic. While Haile Selassie is celebrated for his achievements, his reign was not without challenge, including resistance from conservative elements in Ethiopia, growing inequality, and criticism over his handling of famines. Nevertheless, his legacy is deeply woven into the history of Ethiopia and the broader African independence movement. Haile Selassie, now a lot of people, by the way, a lot of people know Haile Selassie in regards to Rastafarian lifestyle. It is a few people who know that he was a president once. A lot of people don't even know he was a president, more especially Africa. They worship him in a different sphere. They see Haile Selassie in a different way. They don't see him in a political way until you tell the people, okay, that particular person you are mentioning was a president of Ethiopia. Most of them don't even categorize him as a president of a specific geographical area in Africa, but they look at him as a Messiah. Because the words and his targets, his mission and the things that he was doing were things that Africa had not seen before. Okay? And I guess this is why sorry, I'm freezing a little. Now, Emperor Haile Selassie delivered numerous significant speeches during his reign, many of which are remembered for their powerful messages on peace, human rights, freedom, and African unity. Haile Selassie is known for some common words like, it is us today, it will be you tomorrow. Despite his powerful plea, of course, despite his despite of his powerful plea of unity and, of course, creating an understanding environment, people did not take heed of Emperor Selassie's words, because if someone says it is us today, it will be you tomorrow, it shows that probably each of us have to live a positive way for whoever is to come. If at all you think what is affecting me is not going to affect you, then you are definitely going to be surprised, okay? This speech solidifies Haile Selassie's status as a symbol of anti-fascism and resistance. We know very well that Haile Selassie, of course, was among the leaders of Africa that gave us good speeches, that we still hold on, and the so-called Pan-Africanists still live on. Unfortunately, there is more to speeches than actions in Africa nowadays. Upon his coronation as Emperor of Ethiopia in 1930, Haile Selassie delivered a speech emphasizing his commitment to modernizing the country and promoting education, law, and justice. He vowed to bring Ethiopia into a new era of progress and reform, stating his dedication to serve both God and the Ethiopian people. And of course, in his speeches, he said that today we desire, above all, to place our reliance in God, and we shall continue to serve our people with peace, justice, and love. Now, Haile Selassie, this is why basically these are some of the words that Haile Selassie used to speak that a lot of people still take to heart, more especially the Rastafari fraternity. Haile Selassie's address to the United Nations General Assembly in 1963 is another iconic moment in his leadership. In this speech, he called for world peace, human rights, racial equality, and decolonization. His words were later immortalized with the song War, of course, by Bob Marley. The key messages in this particular on this particular day were until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, until they are no longer first-class and second-class citizens of any nation, until the color of man's skin is of no more significance than the color of his eyes, until the basic human rights are equally guaranteed to all without regard to race, there shall be war. The speech was a powerful denunciation of colonialism, racial discrimination, and human rights abuses, and it underscored Haile Selassie's role as a global advocate for peace and justice. Haile Selassie was instrumental in founding the African Union, and in his speech during the inaugural session of the African Union in Addis Ababa in 1963, he remembered for its call for African unity, solidarity, and the end of colonialism. He urged the African nations to work together for the liberation and the development of the continent, stating that Africa's victory, although proclaimed, is not yet totally and may indeed be only partial, for the colonial powers are making desperate attempts to maintain their hold on African territory. If we allow them, if we fail to unite, they may well divide us, and we will fall once more into the old colonial deadlocks and intrigues. If I mention these words, I guess they are ringing in your mind. We've seen a lot of Pan-Africanist speakers using these particular words. Unfortunately, they don't give credit to Haile Selassie and his wordings. I guess most of these words I'm mentioning, it's not the first time you're hearing the same phrases, the same statements, and how they are articulating. But of course, his speech set the tone for the Pan-African movement and efforts towards African independence and collaboration. Now, of course, he also had a speech on the abolition of slavery. That was in 1994. In this speech, Haile Selassie officially declared the abolition of slavery in Ethiopia, aligning the country with international human rights standards and setting a precedent for future reforms in the nation. He recognized the deep-rooted tradition and difficulties in eradicating slavery, but emphasized the necessity of doing so. And he said, let it be known that it is a sin and a crime to enslave others and to live from the fruits of the labor of those who work without pay. As it is our desire to ensure the freedom of all Ethiopian subjects, today we declare all slaves in our dominion shall be set free. Of course, that is a powerful word for whoever was being enslaved at that time and needed to be given the freedom and set free. We remember that he also had an address on, of course, where in this speech, Haile Selassie stressed the importance of education for Ethiopia's future, urging citizens to embrace modernity and learn from the progress of other nations. He emphasized that the movement could not be achieved without a proper education foundation setting. And he said, education is a matter of great importance to us. Without it, we can neither accomplish the tasks we have before us or secure the progress of our people. We cannot build the nation without a literate. We cannot build the nation with illiterate citizens. This speech is deeply philosophical and politically resonate, showcase Haile Selassie's vision for a peaceful, just and united world and his lifelong commitment to human rights education and Africa's unity. Haile Selassie shall be remembered for the greatness he did. His love goes beyond the borders of Ethiopia to the entire world and Africa at large. Now, the connection between Rastafari and Emperor Haile Selassie-I is deeply significantly rooted in religious, cultural, and historical symbolism. Here's a breakdown, of African tradition, love for Africa, and humanity at large. Now, the origin of the Rastafari movement began in Jamaica. That was in the 1930s, inspired by the coronation of Haile Selassie I, or Haile Selassie I as Emperor of Ethiopia in 1930. The movement is a religious and political response to colonialism, slavery, and the oppression of the people of African descendants or descent. Now, at its core, Rastafari emphasizes the return to Africa or the reparation, as we may call it. Now, the liberation of Black people and the belief in Haile Selassie as a divine figure. The movement's name itself comes from Haile Selassie's pre-coronation name, Tafari Makonnen. Now, Ras means chief or prince in Amharic, and Tafari was his given name. And of course, Ras means chief or a prince in Amharic, and then Tafari was his given name. So Rastafari is Prince Tafari. You can say Prince Tafari. So Rastafari, like people call them, we Rastafari or stuff like that. People say it's a movement, but of course it is a movement, and it was named. Of course, after Tafari Makonnen. Haile Selassie as the Messiah. Of course, Rastafarians believe that Haile Selassie is the earthly representation of God, who they call Jah, the returned Messiah and a direct descendant of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. According to Ethiopian tradition, now this belief is rooted in several factors. Now, according to biblical prophecies, Rastafarians interpret Haile Selassie's rise to power as the fulfillment of biblical prophecies, especially the prophecy in the Bible or Book of Revelation 5, chapter 5, verse 5, about the Lion of the tribe of Judah, who would come to redeem the people. Haile Selassie's title as the conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah is viewed as the direct connection to this prophecy. Now, Marcus Garvey's prophecy. Jamaican political leader and Pan-African Marcus Garvey is often seen as a forerunner of the Rastafari movement. He reportedly said, "Look to Africa when a black king shall be crowned, for the day of deliverance is near." Now, when Haile Selassie was crowned emperor in 1930, many Rastafarians saw this as the fulfillment of Garvey's words, confirming Haile Selassie's divine status. Now, Ethiopia and Ethiopia as Zion. Now, Ethiopia is considered a sacred land in Rastafari belief. They see it as Zion, the promised land where people of Africa descent will one day return. A major event in the history of Rastafari was Haile Selassie's state visit to Jamaica, which was on April 21st, that was the 1966. When he arrived, thousands of Rastafarians flooded the airport in Kingston, believing they were seeing the physical manifestation of their God. The date of his visit is celebrated by Rastafarians as Coronation Day, a holy day of reverence for Selassie. Now, Haile Selassie's visit further solidified his status within the movement, though he himself did not publicly claim the divinity that Rastafarians attributed him to. Haile Selassie was aware of the Rastafari movement and its devotion to him. While he never publicly encouraged or acknowledged the belief in his divinity, he was respectful towards Rastafarians and appreciated their admiration for Ethiopia. Now, during his visit to Jamaica, he met the prominent Rasta leader, including Motimo, Plano, and it is said that he expressed that all people should seek God within themselves. Some accounts suggest that Selassie himself was a devotee Christian, a member of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and vowed his position as a servant of God rather than a divine figure. However, the Rastafarian belief in his divinity persisted. Now, reparations Rastafarians believe in returning to Africa, specifically Ethiopia, as a form of liberation from the oppression experienced in the West, referred to as Babylon. So the dreadlocks, many Rastafarians wear dreadlocks as a biblical symbol of their Nazareth vow, reference passages like, of course, in Numbers chapter 6, verse 5, dreadlocks also symbolize strength and connection to Africa's heritage. Rastafaris follow a natural and vegetarian diet, avoiding processed and chemically modified foods. They see this as a way to maintain physical purity. Ganja is considered a sacred herb used for spiritual and meditative purposes. Rastafarians see its use as a way to connect with God and gain deeper insight into the Bible. Or good to say. The Rastafari religious practice often includes ceremonial drumming, chanting, and smoking of ganja in reasoning sessions, which serve as a form of spiritual and philosophical dialogue. The global reach of the Rastafari movement was amplified through the music of Bob Marley, who became one of the most famous Rastafarians. His songs, such as which includes parts of Haile Selassie's 1963 United Nations speech, carried the Rastafari message to a global audience. Marley's music emphasized the themes of resistance, liberation, African unity, and reference for Haile Selassie as a spiritual figure. Haile Selassie died in 1975 under controversial circumstances after being deposed in 1974. His death did not shake the faith of Rastafarians, many of whom believe that Haile Selassie never truly died but rather ascended to a higher spiritual plane. Others interpret his death as a test of faith. While Haile Selassie was a devotee follower of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, there has historically been tension between the church and the Rastafari movement. The church does not recognize Selassie as divine, which contrasts with the Rastafarian beliefs. However, many Rastafarians have developed a difference for Ethiopian Christianity and its deep history. Haile Selassie is both a historical figure and a spiritual icon for the Rastafari movement. While he never embraced the divine status attributed to him, his legacy as a symbol of African sovereignty, resistance against oppression, and spiritual leadership continues to inspire Rastafarians worldwide. His life and reign are viewed through lens of religious reverence and seen as statement to the fight for freedom and dignity for people of Africa's defendant. Listen, Tonfa, Maze. Oh, mama. Sekulila. Solidanza yogera mnange.
Following which northern Ethiopia was effectively under Italian control. On the 26th of April 1936, Badoglio launched what he termed the Iron Rail drive south in front around Deg in Wollo province towards the Abyssinian capital of Addis Ababa, a distance of some 200 km. Propaganda in the fascist media back home in Italy. A large mechanized column was the centerpiece of this drive, with over 2,000 tanks, cars, trucks, and other vehicles included in the operation, which transported some 12,500 Italian troops speedily towards Selassie's capital. By now, the Ethiopian armies were decimated from the northern offensive, and as the Italians neared Addis Ababa in early May, the emperor and his family fled from the capital and made their way towards the border with French Somaliland, crossing over as Selassie went into what would be years of exile from his realm. 3 days later, at roughly 4 p.m. on the afternoon of the 5th of May 1936, 1,700 vehicles. In the hours that followed, Italian troops began entering the city in what was more of a procession than an actual siege, and occupied prominent buildings all over the capital. The Second Italo-Ethiopian War came to an end in May 1936 with the fall of Addis Ababa and the flight of Emperor Haile Selassie from Ethiopia. However, pockets of resistance remained, particularly in the south and west of the country, which was still unoccupied by any attempt years to come. Indeed, all of Abyssinia was never actually brought under effective Italian control. Yet, from May 1936, the Italian government claimed to have won the war. As such, the new colony of Italian Ethiopia was declared to be in existence by Mussolini on the 9th of May 1936. However, this was soon annexed into the newly proclaimed colony of Italian East Africa, which incorporated Abyssinia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland, and which stretched all the way across the Horn of Africa, completing the ambition for Italy to create a contiguous colony here 40 years after it had first been attempted in the mid-1890s. Here, the Italians would impose a brutal form of colonial governance, following many of the quasi-genocidal policies which had been developed in Libya in the 1920s, of confining thousands of people to concentration camps and favoring a divide-and-rule policy, whereby the different ethnic peoples of Ethiopia were pitted against each other. With the Italians now largely in control of his country, Emperor Selassie made his way to Europe. His first mission was to present Abyssinia's case at the League of Nations in Geneva. However, his timing was far from propitious. In Europe, Nazi Germany had initiated an aggressive program of military rearmament in 1935, and in the spring of 1936, while Selassie was fighting in northern Ethiopia, Hitler had ordered his troops into the Rhineland of Western Germany, which German troops had been prevented from entering under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that brought the First World War to an end. Consequently, the governments of Britain and France were no more willing to adopt an aggressive stance against Italy in 1936 than they had been the previous autumn. Nevertheless, while his efforts at redress were in vain, Selassie gained acclaim for a speech he made at a meeting of the League on the 12th of May 1936, in the course of which he denounced the rise of fascism and the use of poison gas by the Italians in East Africa. He was subsequently named Time magazine's Man of the Year, but the result for Ethiopia was the same. The League was unwilling to take concerted action against Italy, which in any event withdrew from membership of it in December 1937. Meanwhile, Selassie headed for England, where he would live in exile throughout the late 1930s. While he was in exile in England, the world's politics was in continual flux. Germany's aggression intensified in 1938 with the annexation of Austria and then Czechoslovakia in 1939. When the Nazis invaded Poland the following September, Britain and France declared war, triggering the start of the Second World War. For the time being, Mussolini adopted a cautious stance and did not enter the war. But when the Germans undertook a blistering military campaign in the summer of 1940 that effectively brought continental Western Europe under Berlin's control, the Italians decided to side with Hitler, declaring war on Britain and France on the 10th of June 1940 and invading southeastern France in an effort to acquire territory there. What this now meant was that the Italians and the British would square off to each other in East Africa. On the 13th of June 1940, an Italian air raid was launched against British Kenya in the first action of the East Africa campaign. This was all part of a wider Italian initiative to conquer Britain's colonies in Egypt and Sudan, and thus unite Italian East Africa with Italy's growing expanse of territory in North Africa. At first, these campaigns proceeded well for Mussolini, but by early 1941, the weaknesses of the Italian military were becoming wholly apparent. Early in 1941, with Italian operations in the Sahara Desert faltering, Mussolini called on Hitler for aid. A German expeditionary force, the famous Afrika Korps, led by Erwin Rommel, was dispatched to North Africa that March, but there would be no major military support offered to the Italian position in East Africa. Thus, in the course of 1941, the British gradually turned the tide here and began pushing the Italians back into Ethiopia and Eritrea after their initial advances into Sudan and Kenya. By this time, Selassie had left Britain and had returned to the Horn of Africa to oversee parts of the campaign to reclaim his homeland from the Italians himself. The fighting here was undertaken by a broad mix of British, Ethiopian, Eritrean, Free French, and Free Belgian forces. Crucially, they had naval superiority, and by early 1941, a new front was being opened in Eritrea following a naval operation in the Red Sea. As a result, by the late spring of 1941, the Italian defense was collapsing on all fronts as the troops in East Africa found themselves effectively cut off from major reinforcement by Mussolini's government. Finally, on the 5th of May 1941, in an event which was stage-managed to occur exactly 5 years after Badoglio had arrived with his Italian forces to Addis Ababa, Selassie re-entered the capital of Ethiopia and proclaimed the liberation of the country from Italy. The restoration of the Solomonic dynasty and Emperor Haile Selassie to power in Ethiopia carried a proviso from the British, who had largely restored the emperor to power. Slavery had to be banned entirely in Ethiopia. There had been piecemeal efforts at doing so as far back as the 1850s, at which time Britain was using its influence as the global superpower of the 19th century to try to curb the slave trade across Africa. These had intensified under Emperor Menelik II and during Selassie's time as regent back in the 1920s, but slavery had never fully been eradicated in Ethiopia and was still a feature of Ethiopian society when the Second Italo-Ethiopian War was initiated in 1935. Following the conquest, the Italians had declared the abolition of slavery a paradoxically humanitarian act for a state which elsewhere in Africa was engaging in genocide, and whose German ally would soon be using the slave labor of millions of Jews, Poles, Czechs, Russians, and other subject peoples across Central and Eastern Europe to drive its war economy. The British government made it clear to Selassie that this abolition needed to continue once he was restored to power, and that he would have to take concerted steps to make a reality of that abolition. A decree was issued by the emperor to that effect in 1942, from which date we might say that slavery was finally in Ethiopia. Though the East Africa campaign had resulted in a significant victory for the Allies in 1941, 4 more years for the Second World War to end in the defeat of Nazi Germany and its allies. When it did, the League of Nations was succeeded by the United Nations, which Ethiopia became a charter member of in 1948. Selassie had gained favorable consideration for his nation when it came to the settlement of East Africa in the aftermath of the conflict, when the Ogaden region was granted to Ethiopia, a region which had long been disputed by the Italians, British, and Abyssinia prior to the war. Selassie's main concern during these years was to continue the modernization of his country. Considerable strides had been made in doing so in the 1920s and 1930s, but there were still deeply entrenched vested interests in the country within the nobility and the church, which were resistant to too much change occurring too rapidly. Selassie was determined to accelerate the pace of change as the war came to an end in the mid-1940s. Eventually, this would result in 1955 with a revised constitution, which moved beyond the Constitution of 1931 and incorporated elements of the US Constitution. However, in practice, the election of parliamentary delegates remained in the hands of the nobility and other powerful bodies, and Ethiopia certainly did not become a Western-style democracy under Selassie's rule in the post-war years. Many controversial issues began to arise in Ethiopia in the post-war period, particularly so during the 1950s. One of these concerned one of the former Italian colonies, Eritrea. This small northern neighbor of Ethiopia's had been placed under British administration following the conclusion of the East Africa Campaign in 1941. In the aftermath of the war, the Allied powers were in favor of Ethiopia's claims to Eritrea, though a small section of the west of the colony was to be joined to British Sudan. Accordingly, when British rule of Eritrea came to an end in the early 1950s, the country was joined with Ethiopia. But this was to be a federal union in which Eritrea retained its own identity and had certain devolved powers held in the hands of its own government. Selassie, though, was determined to bring Eritrea, which provided Ethiopia with access to the Red Sea, under greater centralized control. To this end, in 1962, he dissolved the independent Eritrean parliament and annexed the country. By that time, the Eritrean Liberation Front, or ELF, an independence movement, had launched an armed struggle against Ethiopian rule. The Eritrean War of Independence would continue for the next 30 years, with the conflict becoming a front in the Cold War as the ELF and other independence movements drifted into the Soviet bloc in order to acquire military aid from the USSR, Cuba, and others. The Eritrean War of Independence was not the only conflict which Emperor Selassie's government faced. Ethnic tensions were also becoming more severe in the 1950s and 1960s. Ethiopia is a nation with approximately 80 different ethnic groups. The empire had effectively been formed through conquest over several centuries, and this had resulted in many ethnic groups remaining unreconciled to the dominance of Ethiopia, above all by the Oromo and Amhara peoples, who made up over half of the country's population. Selassie himself was of Oromo descent. The solution, which was favored by Selassie and the Ethiopian government to this situation in the post-war period, was to foster the concept of ethnic federalism, whereby Ethiopia was divided into over a dozen major provinces in which different ethnicities predominated. However, rather than fixing the ethnic problem, this fueled it, ensuring that many Oromo, Amhara, Tigrayans, Somalis, and others continue to shape their identity around their ethnicities rather than their shared identity as Ethiopians. This was already causing unrest in the country during Selassie's reign, but as we will see, this has been compounded in more recent times. Of all the ethnic peoples of Ethiopia, those who were most antagonistic to the government were the Tigrayans, who constituted a sizable proportion of the overall population, roughly 7 or 8%, and were the dominant people in Tigray province in the north of the country. The antipathy of Selassie's government towards the Tigrayans was clear for all to see in the 1950s, as the imperial government persistently neglected the province despite mounting evidence of pressure on its resources and the possibility of famine as a result of the destruction of crops by locusts, drought, and disease, outbreaks of smallpox, typhus, and other high-mortality illnesses. When Tigray eventually did enter famine in 1958, the central government in Addis Ababa did very little to try to relieve the situation, leading to tens of thousands of deaths. Thereafter, a more concerted effort was made in 1959 to address the situation, with Selassie's government being provided with considerable aid from the administration of US President Dwight Eisenhower. Nevertheless, by the time the worst of the famine subsided in 1961, it is estimated that about 100,000 people had died in Tigray and surrounding regions, while renewed famine struck northern Ethiopia again in the mid-1960s. While Selassie's reign was increasingly being blackened by controversies at home, including famine in Tigray, a war of independence in Eritrea, and ethnic tensions within Ethiopia, Selassie and, by extension, Ethiopia continued to hold a position of considerable international respect. As one of the world's longest-serving heads of state, he was usually afforded a position of considerable preeminence at major international events, such as the funeral of President John F. Kennedy in Washington, D.C. in 1963, and of the former French President Charles de Gaulle in France in 1970. Ethiopia also supplied peace contingents to many areas of conflict, such as the Congo in the early 1960s, and became a prominent nation within the non-aligned movement of nations, which were not members of either NATO or the Warsaw Pact, the respective military alliances of the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Perhaps most significant of all in terms of international diplomacy at this time was Selassie's leading role in the establishment of the Organization of African Unity in 1963, the forerunner of the African Union. The headquarters of the Organization of African Unity was located in Addis Ababa for many years under Selassie's rule. Not only did Selassie continue to enjoy a vaunted reputation on the international stage in the second iteration of his reign after the Second World War, but he was viewed by many as a messianic character. In the 1930s, a new quasi-religion and social movement emerged in parts of Africa